I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Garrie.
And together we are the History Boys, explaining to you every week how we got where we are. Because if you don't know where we came from, you'll never work out where we need to go. And timely, I think, this week we're looking at the history of the Labour Party. Now, Adam, just for full disclosure, I joined the Labour Party when I was 13 years old in 1967. You're supposed to be 15 to join, but then I used to look older than my age, a process which I'm glad to say has gone into reverse. I joined when I was 13 at the height of the Vietnam War. Harold Wilson was the Labour Prime Minister. Indeed, because my parents were both Labour activists, since I was a very small child, you could say that I was born into the Labour Party. Now, that was a long time ago. Half a century or more ago. And therefore, I've lived quite a bit of the Labour Party's history. And I knew all about that which happened in its history before I joined it. And I've been, in a small way, a part of its history. I was expelled by Tony Blair over the Iraq War in 2003. And I'm even in the news today in 2019 because I'm demanding that my unjust wartime expulsion be rescinded. We'll see what happens about that. But I'm merely making the point that even you, with all your brilliance, will go some to know more about the Labour Party's history than me. But you are the oracle when it comes to the beginnings of things. So tell the viewers, how did the Labour Party come into being and why?
Well, it came into being for the exact opposite reason of that which is happening now. It started because of working class dissatisfaction with a radical liberal fringe which didn't exactly want to welcome them, wanted to use them, exploit them, gain votes from them, but not actually integrate them into a proper representative political party. Today, over a century later, we're seeing middle-class liberal people in the Labour Party jump ship because it, God forbid, might be too representative of the working class under the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn.
That's a very interesting observation that I have not heard made, so well done to you. It was a necessary consequence, really, of the mass enfranchisement, the gaining of the right to vote by the working class, because, of course, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, virtually no working class people had a vote. And when they did get it, it was only for men.
Absolutely. That was the 1967 People's Representation Act. That
1867.
What did I say? 19?
Yeah.
No, of course. 1867. It was what Lord Derby said to his confidant and deputy Benjamin Disraeli was a great leap in the dark. But it was this People's Representation Act which opened up the door to universal male working class, the franchise to the male working class. In 1832, of course, the members of the merchant classes, the middle classes were enfranchised. The Liberal Party...
Again, only men.
Again, only men. It was after the First World War that some women were fully enfranchised, and after 1928 that all women and all men, irrespective of one's class, got the franchise.
So the Labour pioneers, a bearded Scotsman called Keir Hardie, the leader amongst them, they took the view that the interests of the working class were, and I quote him, entire and separate from the interests of their employers, the ruling class, even where their employers were, quote-unquote, liberals. The bourgeoisie, if you like, was divided, and the aristocracy divided into Tories and liberals. And now that the working class was on the field, it needed a party entirely to itself.
Absolutely. And that was the foundation of the Independent Labour Party, of which Keir Hardie was the founding member. And around the same time, a few years after, the Labour Representation Committee, a slightly less radical but nevertheless working class group, started. Eventually, these groups would amalgamate and become the Labour Party. And they first entered Parliament with help from the Liberals, who are always after an opportunity, so long as it suits them, in the great election of 1906, which itself reversed the mass Tory gains of the 1900 election.
The trade unions were instrumental, weren't they? Tell us about them. But also the socialist sects, you could call them at that time, grouplets, groupuscles, some of them bigger than others, some of them more left-wing than others. But they all coalesced, didn't they, in a trade union-based mass Labour Party.
Absolutely, and that was one of the main differences between the Labour Party and the other two parties. People naturally gravitated in towards a position into the Conservatives and Liberals because of a common social background, because they went to the same school, because they had the same surname as someone else who was friends with someone of a previous generation with the same surname, where the Labour Party coalesced around people that didn't smoke cigars together
didn't
at the
have
same
a name.
club.
Their leaders were nameless,
indeed,
lineageless.
But they worked together.
Yes, in terms of the prevailing orthodoxy, this was an entirely new phenomenon. Rough working men wearing cloth caps and mufflers and cheap suits suddenly appearing in the House of Commons.
Absolutely. It was the bridge which spanned the Great Reform Act, and these people actually not just remonstrating that they should be able to have representation, but that they should actually be able to represent themselves based on the vote of their fellow working class man and eventually man and woman. It might seem a bit passé today to even think about this, but this is what led to a democracy of the few becoming a universal democracy. This was indeed that moment when the people who became enfranchised at the ballot box said to themselves, we want to become empowered on those green benches of the House of Commons.
Now, although socialists have always been in the Labour Party, I would argue that Labour has never been a socialist party. What do you think of that?
In many ways, that's very true, because there were other more genuine, fully fledged, ideologically based socialist parties at the time. There was Henry Hyndman, whose party eventually lost a lot of its momentum after the First World War. There was, of course...
Because he went jingo.
Indeed. And there was the difference between the Independent Labour Party and the Labour Party. Even though they cooperated, the most radical elements were always in the ILP, which incidentally in the 1930s split from the rest of the Labour Party, and we saw a reduced Labour Party, one rebuilding itself under the leadership of Clement Attlee, while Red Clyde's side, people like Jimmy Maxton, were dominant in the ILP.
The socialists never went away. Some, like me, were expelled. Michael Foot was expelled, and Aaron Bevan was expelled. Many people like me were expelled from the Labour Party. Most of them got back. I might or might not get back. But the socialist strain in the Labour Party was present in the great reforming coalition government or Labour government of 1945. You mentioned him already. Clement Attlee, a man, I believe, strikingly similar in character, not in political views necessarily, but in character, to today's Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn.
That's absolutely true. Both of them are personally austere, but they don't wish austerity on the people. Both are incredibly understated, and both had that rare political penchant for actually practicing what they preach. Jeremy Corbyn was behind the scenes the same man he is at the dispatch box. The same was absolutely true of Clement Attlee, so much so that Winston Churchill apocryphally mentioned that an empty taxi pulled up to Westminster and Clement Attlee got out.
I should say that Churchill absolutely denies ever having said so or ever having thought so. He did, of course, rely heavily on Attlee during the Second World War, when Attlee was the effectively Deputy Prime Minister of Britain in what was a cross-class alliance in defence of this country against the fascist menace. But Attlee won in 1945, tipped Churchill out onto his well-upholstered posterior and began to change Britain in ways that remain extant today.
Absolutely, and it was in many ways an unlikely victory if one were to look at 1935, when Attlee became the leader of a Labour Party that was beaten and broken by the ratting of Ramsay MacDonald to a national government, after which he was expelled from Labour, never to return. But Attlee worked steadily and quietly to rebuild the party from the mid-1930s onward, and when he got into government in 1945, the most understated man in Britain perhaps was able to effect changes to the country that continue to shape the country to this day. The idea that one shouldn't be homeless because of a permanent welfare state, the idea of a modern comprehensive national insurance program, the National Health Service, the idea that no one based on age, race, and most especially class should be rejected from seeing a surgeon, from seeing a GP, from getting any kind of medical care. These were reforms brought in by Attlee.
This was socialism in practice, wasn't it? I mean, the National Health Service, when people say they don't like socialism, you just have to tell them that the National Health Service is literally socialism in action.
It is, yes. What else could it possibly be called? It's not a business, it's not a charity, it's the government, through tax money, running a system that benefits public welfare.
Now, Attlee was so unprepossessing in the 1945 election, he drove himself around in his car, him and his wife and him sharing the driving. That's how he fought the 1945 election, in which he won a Labour landslide. And he did bring in the NHS, nationalise some of the commanding heights of the British economy. But he was quite soon afterwards out. And Labour then descended into something like the internecine left-right fighting that we're watching today, the Gaitskell-Bevan split.
Absolutely. Attlee was able to hold the country together for a while and hold the party together for a long while, 20 years in fact, because of this steady, demure, austere, but very hard-working persona. After he died and Churchill got back in 1951, people again went at each other's throats, as they did within Labour during the First World War, as they did during the National Labour split post-1931. Only this time the ideological corners were probably more defined than ever, and they were based around the personages of two larger-than-life men, whatever one thinks about them. There was the man who eventually became leader in 55, Hugh Gaitskell, on the one side, and there was sort of the arch-radical of the party, Aneurin Bevan, a man who himself was one of the biggest organisers of the initial NHS. Some might call him Mr. NHS in many ways. Indeed. And he was arguing for a left-wing approach.
And he started life at the coalface, literally, as a miner in the South Wales coalfield. He was a self-taught intellectual, but an intellectual of the very highest rank. He was a wonderful orator, wonderfully read, and the Bevanites became Jeremy Corbyn, really, didn't they?
Well, yes. I mean, there was Michael Foot, who was one of, you could call him the apprentice to Aneurin Bevan. And after him came the generation where yourself got elected to Parliament as a Labour member, where Jeremy Corbyn came in. And this way of thinking is truly the inheritance of this tradition, this Bevanite tradition, of which the generation of Michael Foot and Tony Benn were an interim one before the one we have today.
Now, Mr. Benn was, as was Mr. Foot, I should say, a very close friend of mine, but politically I was much closer to Mr. Benn from the mid-1970s until his death. My wife and I attended his funeral. Mr. Benn was the greatest socialist prime minister we never had, wasn't he?
Michael Foot might have something to say about that, but Tony Benn was someone where they joked about him. Speaking of reversing age as one progresses through the years, Tony Benn was someone who began his life as someone who could have just about almost been considered a proto-Gaitskellite, and he ended his career being far to the left of any Labour frontbencher that there just about ever was. But throughout that life, he did maintain a consistency in terms of his values. He resented the aristocracy democracy he was born into. He resented the anti-democratic traditions that for too long held parliamentary democracy back, and that meant that just as he was for the enfranchisement of working-class men and of all women, he too came to be the leading opponent of European integration and of British membership into this European common market, later the EU itself. He was a towering Eurosceptic, a towering Democrat, a towering proponent of the welfare state, and too many people who today their minds have been manipulated by a dishonest media who think that only the inheritors of the Enoch Powell tradition of Euroscepticism are proper Eurosceptics. They don't know anything about 40 years' worth of Tony Benn's oratory, his hustings, his campaigning, his parliamentary activity.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's going to be an issue that will further divide Labour, I think. Mr. Benn was the most visceral and coruscating opponent of the European Union that I ever came across, for entirely different reasons to some of those who might be called Brexiteers today. There was nothing in common between Mr. Benn and Boris Johnson, for example. Mr. Benn had way more class, apart from anything else.
Yes.
But Benn opposed the European Union for two reasons. First of all, he recognized that without democracy, you cannot have successful government. And if you cannot elect and cannot remove the people who are effectively governing you, then you don't live in a democracy at all. And secondly, and this I hope Mr. Corbyn takes note of, you cannot have the kind of policies that Mr. Benn and Jeremy Corbyn stand for if you are in the European Union, because they're illegal to practice under the European Union. You must open all your services to private tender. You must allow Richard Branson to compete to run your railway lines. You're not allowed to decree that the state will intervene in this or that industry, give this or that contract to this or that British company rather than a company from Lithuania. You're simply forbidden from doing these things by a group of people that you didn't elect.
And that was indeed the entire Bennite case for Euroscepticism, and it was one that was deeply historically informed. Benn spoke from the platforms, from the rostrums, from the House of Commons, and he said the Labour movement didn't work a century, Reform Act after Reform Act, to get working class votes for members of parliament, to get working class people and their allies into parliament, just for someone called Ted Heath to sign it all away, for rich generally, aloof generally, and anti-democratic totally technocrats sitting in Salzburg or in Brussels. So it was as if all of the fights and the struggles and the people who literally died to gain democratic representation saw it all signed away at the stroke of Mr. Heath's pen without anyone putting up much of a fight. And that is what was infuriating to Tony Benn, is that being part of a European project which subsumed parliamentary sovereignty and challenged parliamentary supremacy, which by then also meant the supremacy of the working class vote, it was just a reversal of a long fight which Mr. Benn and his forebearers played a very substantial role in securing and maintaining.
Now, let's come closer up to date. Mr. Tony Blair, a latter-day Ramsay MacDonald, in my view.
Far worse in mine.
Far worse, yes, far worse. Killed a lot more people.
Indeed.
In fact, MacDonald was a pacifist. He never killed anybody.
Except his own career.
Yes.
Eventually.
He opposed the First World War, which was a very courageous, exceedingly courageous thing to do, amidst all the trumpets and the bands. Blair almost wrecked the Labour Party, didn't he?
I think he wrecked it totally, because it's essentially, the Labour Party may well be in the same building, but what's a house without a home? You could have the same structure, and if a different family moves in, it's a different home, it's a different place, it serves a different purpose. What Tony Blair did is transform the Labour Party of the 1990s into what the Liberal Party aspired to be in the 1970s and 1980s. Frankly, in some ways, he even moved it to the right of what some liberals in the 70s and 80s aspired to. And I'm not saying that someone on the left is automatically good or someone on the right is automatically bad. I'm not a liberal. I am a centrist. I see great good in what people like Attlee in particular did. But what Blair did in transforming the Labour Party into a Liberal Party was supremely dishonest. This was the same dishonesty which led to every single war of the multiple wars that Tony Blair went into. It was the same dishonesty which allowed him to become a man who said much and meant little. And it's what allowed him to snake his way through the body politic of Parliament, of NATO, of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and of all the other tin pot dictatorships that he works for in one capacity or another, without ever being even rhetorically held to account by the other powers that be.
We shouldn't forget his Congressional Medal of Honor presented to him by George W. Bush, his proudest possession.
Ironically done in the same building where you excoriated members of that same Congress who went to Tony Blair's war. The irony of ironies.
That's true. I hadn't thought of that. Now, Blair was the leader for a long time. After the untimely death of the late John Smith, another close friend of mine. I actually have been friends of Labour leaders since Harold Wilson. I grew quite close to Harold Wilson in his later retirement years. I used to visit him in his rather gloomy flat behind Westminster Cathedral. I knew James Callaghan very well. I knew Mr. Foote very well. I was offered lodgings in Neil Kinnock's house in Ealing when I first moved down to London. But the line breaks when it comes to Tony Blair. And as I say, he ultimately would expel me from the Labour Party. Though he departed, the phalanx, and it's a big one, of Blairites are still there, or at least they were still there when we started recording. Tell us about that dichotomy.
Well, when Harold Wilson took leadership of the Labour Party and ultimately became Prime Minister for the first time in '64, he represented a kind of middle road that sought to smooth out the schism between the Bevanites and the Gaitskillites. What you saw in the 21st century with the election twice of Jeremy Corbyn, because of course he was defenestrated once, only to win a second time in terms of being the party leader with a bigger leadership, you have a leader of a party who represents what should be called an Attlee tradition, a Bevanite tradition, a Footite and Benite tradition. But this tradition, which is just the new generation of this old tradition, is being held back by a parliamentary Labour Party, which almost to a man and woman is full of people who want to be in a liberal-style party led by a man like, or perhaps by, a man called Tony Blair. They don't care that everyone knows that he's discredited throughout the country, hated by the real left, hated by the real right, hated by the real centre. They still see this man as a money-drenched oracle of serpentine political manoeuvres who they think can propel them back into a position of honour, because all of these people have been dishonoured by their own words. They're opposed to Brexit, and instead of saying that, they call the leader of the party an anti-Semite, which he isn't, no more than Tony Benn, no more than Clement Attlee, no more than an Iron Bevan. These are people who are so lusting for power that they call Jeremy Corbyn someone who didn't like the Soviet Union because it was to the right of him in many ways at the time. They call him a Soviet agent, sometimes a Czech agent, and when that doesn't work, they call him an agent of either Hamas or Hezbollah, two organizations in the Middle East with totally different constituencies and points of view. There's no dirty trick in the book that these people haven't used against Corbyn. It's a real shame.
Well, I wish I'd said that. I will. I will. Now, as I looked at my watch, 9 Labour MPs have now defected from Mr. Corbyn's Labour Party. 3 Conservatives have defected from Mrs. May's Conservative Party. Is this a splinter or is it a split?
Well, I think it's a long overdue split, because when you have two parties and in some cases, after David Cameron, certainly, 3 parties that all largely stood for the same thing under different names. The people were being cheated. There should be a Labour Party which stands for socialism. There should be a Conservative Party which stands for the Church of England, the Queen of England, the traditional class system, and, you know, fish, chips, biscuits, and the rest of it. And there should be a Liberal Party which opposes all of those things because they're just not European enough, none of them. And so let the people decide. Let a party do in real life what it says on the tin. And there was previously a quiet conspiracy, not that anyone conspired, but a conspiracy of surreality, whereby a Cameron-esque Tory party, a post-Blair Miliband-esque Labour Party, and whoever's in charge of the Liberals throughout this period, quite right, they all sort of agreed to all stand for the same thing. Then Brexit came along and suddenly the penny dropped because there were liberal Blairites who loved the European Union as much as they loved Tony Blair, and then there were Bennites, there were Corbynites, there were Gallowayites who said, no, we want to do what we said we wanted to do in the 1970s. And in the Tory party, there were David Cameron liberals who think that unemployment and war isn't as important as driving an overpriced hybrid car and eating organic, non-gluten, dairyized ice cream. And they are liberals.
And hugging huskies in the Arctic.
And then you've got the genuine Tories, the people like Rees-Mogg, who fell straight out of a hot air balloon from the 17th century. You have people like Nigel Farage, a good 1950s lad himself, and these are the real Tories. And so, frankly, if I were Vince Cable, who's the leader of the Liberal Party, I would say, where have you been for the last 10 years? We should have been the biggest party because you were all Liberals. To paraphrase Richard Nixon, we are all Liberals now, but not after Brexit, not anymore. So we're seeing a return to genuine conservatism, even pre-Thatcherite conservatism in many ways, true Toryism. You're seeing a return in the form of Jeremy Corbyn of genuine socialism, and possibly once the members on the right of Labour and the left of the Tories decide whether they want to become a company or a party, there's Uncle Vince saying, I've got the party machinery, let's all be Liberal together.
And also he could say, I'm very, very old and I'm ready to go, and one of you can be the leader.
Exactly, one of these people who aren't even a household name in their own home, going back to the residence metaphor. But it really is watching these people leave their parties at this pivotal moment just before Brexit. It is like watching healthy rats jumping from a sturdy lifeboat back onto the Titanic. This is, frankly, if politics was more honest, and if the media held politicians to account, this would have happened much earlier.
And if we had, last moment, I'm afraid, if we had an electoral system which allowed these real currents of political ideas to be represented in Parliament, instead of this crazy first-past-the-post system, which forces 2 big tents to try and contain within each of them all the different currents that actually exist in real life, if we had an electoral system that would allow, dare I say it, like a European model, where everybody can stand with their own programme for their own ideas, everyone has a chance of being elected, and then let's have a parliament that is genuinely representative of the people. I think that would be a very big step forward indeed. Alas, we've run out of time. I've been George Galloway.
And I've been Adam Garrie.
And together, we've been the History Boys.